I'm back. I figured today I would do another ASMR video since the other one, I actually listened to it this time. Audio quality's not the best, but I work with what I've got. And was not very good at whispering, apparently. So we're going to go to chapter 2. Where is it? I read ahead in it for the 7th time. So I got to go find chapter 2 now. Oh, yes. So we're in New Spring. The prologue book for The Wheel of Time, written by Robert Jordan. This will be ASMR style, so I will be whispering. I hope you all can hear me. I might try another ASMR video at another time that does not involve reading. I just gotta look up techniques. For now, this is what I've caught. Chapter 2, A Wish Fulfilled. Despite a fire blazing on the green marble hearth, the Amerlin sitting room was cold enough to make Moraine shiver, and only a tight upper jaw kept her teeth from chattering. Of course, it also stopped her from yawning, which would never have done, half a night's sleep or not. The colorful winter tapestries hanging on the walls, bright scenes of spring and garden parks, ought to have had a coating of frost, and icicles should have been hanging from the scroll-carved cornices. For one thing, the fireplace lay on the other side of the room from her, and its warmth did not extend far. For another, the tall glass casements behind her, filling the arched windows that led onto the balcony overlooking the Amerlin's private garden, did not fit as well as they might, and they leaked cold around the edges. Whenever the wind gusted outside, an icy breeze hit her back and cut through her woolen dress. Another struck her closest friend as well, but for all that Suan was tyrant, she would not have let it show if she were freezing to death. The Sun Palace in Cairn, where Moraine had done most of her growing up, had often been as cold as in winter, yet there she had never been forced to stand in draughts. The chill seeped from the marble floor tiles, through the flowered Illioner carpet and Moraine's slippers too. The golden signet ring on her left hand, the snake biting its own tail that symbolized eternity and continuity, and an initiate's bond to the tower, felt like a band of ice. When the Amerlin told and accepted to stand over there and not bother her, however, the accepted stood where the Amerlin pointed and tried not to let her notice any shivers. Worse than the cold, really, was the heavy smell of acrid smoke that even the heavy draughts could not dispel. It was not the smoke of chimneys, but of burned villages around Tarvalon. Concentration on the cold kept her from fretting over the smoke and the battle. The sky outside the windows held the gray of early morning now. Soon the fighting would begin again, if it had not already. She wanted to know how the battle was going. She had a right to know. Her uncle had started this war. She certainly did not excuse the Isle in the slightest for the destruction they brought to Cairn, city and nation, but she knew where the ultimate blame lay. Since the Isle arrived, though, Accepted had been confined to tower grounds as strictly as novices. The world outside the walls might as well have ceased to exist. Reports came at regular intervals from Azil Marid, High Captain of the Tower Guard, but the contents were not shared with anyone except full sisters, if with them. Questions about the fighting addressed to an Aes Sedai earned admonitions to concentrate on your studies. As though the largest battles fought since Arthur Hawkwing's time, and practically under her nose, was a mere distraction. Moraine knew she could not be involved in any meaningful way. Not in any way, really. Yet she wanted to be, if only by knowing what was happening. That might be illogical, But then she had never thought she was going to join the White Aja when she gained the shawl. The two silk-gowned women in shades of blue, seated on the opposite sides of the small writing table on the side of the room, gave no sign that they were aware of the smoke or the cold, though they were almost as far from the fireplace as she. Of course, they were Aes Sedai, with ageless faces, and for the smoke they had certainly seen the aftermath of more battles than any general. They could remain serenity made flesh if 1,000 villages burned in front of them. No one became Aes Sedai without learning to control her emotions at need, inwardly and outwardly. Tamra and Jatara did not seem tired, though they had only taken cat naps since the fighting began. That was why they had accepted in attendance all night, in case they wanted errands run or someone brought to them. As for the cold, neither cold nor heat touched sisters the way it did other people. They always appeared unaware of either. Moiraine had tried to work out how that was done. Every accepted tried sooner or later. However it was worked, it did not involve the One Power, or she would have been able to see the weaves, or at least feel them. Tamra was more than simply Aes Sedai. She was the Amyrlin seat, the ruler over all Aes Sedai. She had been raised from the blue, but of course, the long stole draped on her shoulders was striped in the colors of the 7 Ajas, to show that the Amyrlin was of all Ajas and none. Over the history of the tower, some Amyrlins had taken that more literally than others. Tamra's skirts were slashed with all 7 colors, though that was not required. No Aja could feel itself advantaged or disadvantaged with her. Beyond the tower, when Tamra Ospina spoke, kings and queens listened, whether they had Aes Sedai advisors or hated the White Tower. That was the power of the Amyrlin seat. They might not take her advice or obey her instructions, but they listened, and politely. Even the High Lords of Tyr and the Lord Captain Commander of the Children of the Light did that much. Her long hair, lightly streaked with gray, and caught in a jeweled silver net, framed a square, determined face. She usually got her way with rulers, but she did not take her power lightly or use it indiscriminately, either outside the tower or inside. Tamra was fair and just, which were not always the same thing, and she was often kind. Moiraine admired her greatly. The other woman, Tamra's keeper of the chronicles, was a different matter altogether. Perhaps the second most powerful woman in the tower, and certainly at least equal to the sitters. Jatara Moroso was always just and usually fair, but kindness never seemed to occur to her. She was also flamboyant enough for a green or a yellow. Tall and close to voluptuous, she wore a wide necklace of fire drops, earrings with rubies the size of pigeons' eggs, and 3 jeweled rings beside her great serpent ring. Her dress was a deeper blue than Tamra's, and brocaded, and the keeper's stole on her shoulders, blue, since she had also been raised from the blue, was nearly wide enough to be called a shawl. Moiraine had heard that Jatara still considered herself a blue, which would be shocking if true. The width of her stole certainly spoke in favor of the whispers. That was a matter of personal choice. As with all Aes Sedai, once they had worked long enough with the One Power, it was impossible to put an age to Jatara's face. At a glance, you might think she was no more than 25, perhaps less. Then a second glance would say a youthful 45 or 50, and still just short of great beauty, while a third changed it all again. That smooth, ageless face was the mark of Aes Sedai to those who knew. To those who did not know, and many did not, her hair would have added to the confusion. Caught with carved ivory combs, it was white as snow. By whispered rumor, she was over 300 years old, very old even for an Aes Sedai. Speaking of a sister's age was extremely rude. Even another sister would be given a penance for it. A novice or accepted would find herself sent to the mistress of novices for a switching. But surely thinking about it did not count. Something else placed Jatara out of the ordinary. She had the foretelling sometimes, the talent of speaking what was still in the future. That was a very rare talent, and came to her only occasionally. But gossip, the accepted quarters overflowed with tittle-tattle. Gossip said that Jatara had had more than one foretelling in the last few months. Some claimed that the reason the armies outside the city had been in place when the Isle came was one of Jatara's foretellings. No one among the accepted knew for certain, of course. Maybe some of the other sisters did. Maybe. Even when the fact that Jatara had had a foretelling was common knowledge, sometimes no one other than Tamra learned what it had been. It was foolish to hope to be present when Jatara had a foretelling, yet Moraine had hoped. But in the 4 hours since she and Siuan had replaced Tamale and Brendis in attendance on the Amerlin, Jatara had only been there writing a letter. It suddenly hit her that close on 4 hours was a very long time to spend on one letter, and Jatara had not covered half of one sheet of paper yet. She was sitting there with her pen suspended above the cream-colored page. As if Moraine, thinking of it, had somehow reached her, Jatara glanced at the pen and made a small sound of irritation, then swirled the steel nib in a small red-glazed bowl of alcohol to clean away the dried ink, clearly not for the first time. The liquid in the bowl was as black as that in the silver-capped ink jar of cut glass on the table. A gilt-edged leather folder full of papers lay open in front of Tamra, and she appeared to be studying them intensely. Yet Moraine could not remember seeing the Amerlin turn over a single sheet. The 2 Aes Sedai faces were images of cool calm, but plainly they were worried, and that made her worried too. She bit at her lower lip in furious thought, then had to stop when a yawn threatened. The biting, not the thinking. It had to be something to make them worry today in particular. She had seen Tamra in the corridors yesterday, and if there had been a woman bubbling with confidence, it was her. So, the battle that had been raging for the last 3 days. If Jatara really had foretold the battle, if she really had had other foretellings, what else might they have been? Guessing would do no good, but reasoning might. The Isle crossing the bridges and breaking into the city? Impossible. In 3,000 years, while nations rose and fell, and even Hawkwing's empire was swept away in fire and chaos, no army had managed to breach Tarvalon's walls or break down its gates, and quite a few had tried over that time. Perhaps the battle turning to disaster in some other way? Or something needed to avoid disaster? Tamra and Jatara were the only 2 Aes Sedai actually in the tower at that moment, unless some had returned in the night. There had been talk of injured soldiers in such numbers that all sisters with the smallest ability at healing were needed. But no one had said straight out that was where they were going. Aes Sedai could not lie, yet they often spoke obliquely, and they were not above misdirection. Sisters also could use the power as a weapon if they or their warders were in danger. No Aes Sedai had taken part in battle since the Trolloc Wars, when they faced Shadowspawn and armies of Dark Friends. But perhaps Jatara had fooled disaster, unless Aes Sedai joined. But why wait until the third day? Could a foretelling be that detailed? Maybe if the sisters had entered the battle earlier, that would have caused. Out of the corner of her eye, Moraine saw Siuan smiling at her. That smile turned Siuan's face from handsome to pretty, and made her clear blue eyes sparkle. Nearly a hand taller than Moraine, Moraine had gotten over the irritation she'd once felt at being shorter than nearly all the women around her, but she could never help noticing height. Taller and almost as fair-skinned as she, Siuan wore her formal acceptance dress with an air of assurance that Moraine had never quite mastered. The high-necked dresses were the purest white, except for the bands at hem and cuffs that copied the Emerlin's seven-striped stole. She could not understand how so many sisters of the White Aja could bear to wear white all the time, as if they were forever in mourning. For her, the hardest part about being a novice had been dressing in plain white day after day. The hardest aside from learning to control her temper anyway. That still dropped her in hot water now and then, but not so often as during her first year. We'll find out when we find out, Siuan whispered within the quick glance at Tamra and Jatara. Neither moved an inch. Jatara's pen was held over the letter again, the ink drying. Moraine could not help smiling back. Siuan had that gift, making her smile when she wanted to frown and laugh when she wanted to weep. The smile turned into a yawn, and she looked hastily to see whether the Emerlin or the keeper had noticed. They were still absorbed in their own thoughts. When she turned back, Siuan had a hand over her mouth and was glaring at her over it, which almost set her giggling. It had surprised her at first, she and Siuan becoming friends, but among novices and accepted the closest friends always seemed to be very much alike or very different. In some things she and Siuan were alike. They were both orphans. Their mothers had died while they were young, their fathers since they left home. And both had been born with the spark, which was uncommon. They would have begun channeling the power eventually, whether or not they had tried to learn how. Not every woman could learn by any means. That was where the differences began before they arrived in Tarvalon. And it was not just that Siuan had been born poor and she wealthy. In Cairhien, Aes Sedai were respected, and Moraine had been given a grand dance at the Sun Palace to celebrate her departure for the White Tower. In Tyr, channeling was outlawed, and Aes Sedai were not popular. Siuan had been bundled onto a ship bound upriver for Tarvalon the very day his sister discovered she could learn to channel. There were so many differences, though none mattered between them. Among other things, Siuan had come to the tower in full control of her temper. She was quick with puzzles, which Moraine was not, and she could not abide horses, which Moraine loved. And she learned at a rate that left Moraine dazed. Oh, not about channeling the one power. They had been entered in the novice book on the same day, and moved almost in lockstep with the power, even to passing for accepted on the same day. Moraine, though, had received the education expected of a noblewoman, everything from history to the old tongue, which she spoke and read well enough that she had been excused classes in it. The daughter of a tyrant fisherman, Suan arrived barely able to read or do more than the simplest arithmetic, but she had soaked her lessons in like sand soaking up water. She taught the old tongue to novices now, at least the beginning classes. Suan Sanshi was held up to novices as an example of what they should aspire to. Well, both of them were. Only one other woman had ever finished novice training in just 3 years. Elida I. Royhan, a detestable woman, had completed her time as accepted in 3 years too, also a record, and it seemed at least possible that they might match that as well. Moraine was all too aware of her own shortcomings, but she thought that Suan would make a perfect Aes Sedai. She opened her mouth to whisper that patience was for stones, but wind rattled the casements, and another blast of freezing air hit her. She might as well have been standing in her shift for all the protection her dress gave. Instead of whispering, she gasped loudly. Tamara turned her head towards the windows, yet not because of more rain. The sound of distant trumpets suddenly was floating on the wind, dozens of them. No, hundreds. To be heard here inside the tower, there would have to be hundreds. And the sound was continuous, call rolling over call. Whatever the cause, it must be urgent. The Emerald closed the folder lying before her with a slap. Go see if there's news from the battlefield, Moraine. Tamara spoke almost normally, but her voice held an unidentifiable edge, a sharpness. Swan, make some tea. Quickly, child. Moraine blinked. The Emerald was worried, but there was only one thing to do. It will be as you say, Mother, she and Suan said together without hesitation, offering deep curtsies, and turned for the door to the anteroom beside the fireplace. The gold-chased silver pot sat on a ropework tray on a table near the door, along with a tea canister, a honey jar, a small pitcher of milk, and a large pitcher of water, all worked in silver. A second tray held cups made of delicate green seafoam porcelain. Moraine felt a faint tingle as Swan opened herself to the source and embraced Sadar, the female half of the power. A glow surrounded her, though it would only be visible to another woman who could channel. Normally channeling to do chores was forbidden, yet the Amberlin had said quickly. Suan was already preparing a thin thread of fire to bring the tea water to a boil. Neither Tamara nor Jatara spoke a word to stop her. The anteroom to the Amberlin's apartments was not large, since it was only meant to hold a few visitors until they could be announced. Delegations came to the Amberlin in one of the audience halls or in her study next door, not her private chambers. Backed by the sitting room fireplace, the anteroom was almost warm. There was only one chair, simply carved but large. Yet despite its weight, the chair had been dragged closer to one of the gilded stand lamps, so Ellen Worrell, the slender novice on duty, would have better light to read. Facing away from the sitting room door and intent on her wood-bound book, she did not hear Moraine cross the fringed carpet. Ellen should have felt her presence long before she was close enough to peer over the child's shoulder. Not really a child, since she had been 7 years a novice and had come to the tower at 18. But a novice was referred to as a child, no matter her age. For that matter, Aes Sedai called accepted child, too. Moraine had been able to feel the child's ability to channel soon after entering the room. Ellen certainly should have been able to sense hers from this near. One woman who could channel could never sneak up on another if the second was paying attention. Peering over Ellen's shoulder, she recognized the book instantly. Hearts of Flame, a collection of love stories. The Tower Library was the largest in the known world, containing copies of almost every book that had ever been printed. But this was unsuitable for a novice. Accepted were granted a little leeway. By that time, you knew that you would watch your husband age and die, and your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, while you changed not at all. But novices were quietly discouraged from thinking about men or love, and kept away from men entirely. It would never do for a novice to try running away to get married, or, worse, to get herself with child. Novice training was purposefully hard. If you were going to break, better it happened as a novice than as a sister. Being Aes Sedai was truly hard, and adding a child to it would only make matters beyond difficult. You should find more appropriate reading, Ellen, Maureen said levelly, and pay more attention to your duties. Before Maureen finished speaking, Ellen leaped to her feet with a startled gasp, the book tumbling to the floor and whirled around. She was not tall for an Andoran, but Maureen still had to look up to meet her eyes. When she saw Maureen, she heaved a small sigh of relief, very small. To novices, accepted were only a tiny step below Aes Sedai. Ellen spread her plain white skirts in a hasty curtsy. No one could have come in without me seeing Maureen. Marion said I could read. She tilted her head to one side, toying with the wide white ribbon that held her hair. Everything novices wore was white, even their thin leather slippers. Why is that book inappropriate, Maureen? She was 3 years the elder, but the great serpent ring and banded skirts marked a fount of knowledge in novices' eyes. Unfortunately, there were subjects Maureen felt uncomfortable talking about with just anyone. There was such a thing as decorum. Picking up the volume, she handed it back to the novice. The librarians would be very put out if you returned one of their books in damaged condition. She felt a measure of satisfaction at that. It was the sort of reply a full sister might have given when she did not want to answer the question. Accepted practiced the Aes Sedai way of speaking against the day they gained the shawl, but the only ones to practice on safely were the novices. Some tried it with the servants for a little while, but that only got them laughed at. Servants knew very well that in Aes Sedai eyes, accepted were not a small step below sisters, but a small step above novices. As hoped for, Ellen anxiously began examining the book for damage, as Maureen went on before the novice could come back to her embarrassing question. Have there been any messages from the field of battle, child? Ellen's eyes widened indignantly. You know I'd have brought it in right away if there'd been any message, Maureen. You know I would. She did know. Samara had known too. But while the keeper or a sitter might point out that the Amerlin had given a foolish order, at least she thought they might, and accepted could only obey. For that matter, novices were not supposed to point out that an accepted had asked a foolish question. Is that the proper way to answer, Ellen? No, Maureen, Ellen said contritely, bobbing another curtsy. There hasn't been any message the whole time I've been here. Her head tilted again. Did Jatara said I have a foretelling? Go back to your reading, child. As soon as the words were out of her mouth, Maureen knew they were wrong, contradicting what she had said before. It was too late for a recovery now, though. Turning quickly and hoping that Ellen had not noticed the blush suddenly heating her face. She glided out of the anteroom with as much dignity as she could muster. Well, the mistress of novices had told the child she could read, and the librarians had let her take the book, if one of the accepted had not loaned it to her. But Moraine did hate sounding like a fool. A faint trickle of steam was rising from the teapot spout, and more from the water pitcher when Moraine re-entered the sitting room and closed the door. The glow of Cedar no longer shone around Suan. Water boiled very quickly when the wind power was used. The trick was to keep it all from flashing to steam. Suan had filled 2 of the green cups, and was stirring honey into one. The other was milky. Suan pushed the cup she had been stirring toward Moraine. "Chitaras," she said softly, and then in a whisper, with a grimace, "She likes enough honey to turn it into syrup. She told me not to be stingy." The porcelain was just barely too hot on Moraine's fingertips, but it should be cooled to exactly the right point by the time she crossed the room to the writing table, where Chitara still sat, now drumming her fingers on the tabletop impatiently. The polished black clock on the mantel over the fireplace chimed first rise. The trumpets were still calling. They seemed to sound frantic, though Moraine knew that was only imagination. Tamara was standing at the windows, peering out at a sky that was growing brighter by the moment. She continued to stare out after Suan had curtsied and proffered her cup, then finally turned and saw Moraine. Instead of taking the tea, she said, "What news, Moraine? You know better than to delay." Oh, she was on edge to speak so. She had to know Moraine would have spoken immediately if there had been anything. Moraine was just offering Chitara her own cup, but before she could reply, the keeper jerked to her feet, bumping the table so hard that the ink jar overturned, spilling a pool of black across the tabletop. Trembling, she stood with her arms rigid at her sides, and stared over the top of Moraine's head, wide-eyed with terror. It was terror, plain and simple. "He is born again!" Chitara cried. "I feel him. The dragon takes his first breath on the slope of Dragon Mount. He is coming! He is coming! Light help us! Light help the world! He lies in the snow and cries like thunder. He burns like the sun!" With the last word, she gasped a tiny sound, and fell forward into Moraine's arms. Moraine dropped the teacup to try to catch her, but the truth of it was that the larger woman bore both of them to the carpet. It was all Moraine could do to end up on her knees holding Chitara, rather than lying beneath her. In an instant, Tamara was there, kneeling, careless of the ink trickling from the table. The light of Cedar already surrounded her, and she already had a weave prepared of spirit, air, and water. Gripping Chitara's head between her hands, she let the weave sink in to the still form. But delving, used to check health, did not turn to healing. Looking helplessly into Chitara's staring eyes, Moraine knew why not. She had hoped there was some tiny fragment of life left, something that Tamara could work with. Healing could cure any sickness, mend any injury, but you could not heal death. The pool of ink on the table had spread to ruin whatever the keeper had been writing. It was very odd what you noticed at a time like this. "Not now, Chitara," Tamara breathed softly. She sounded weary to the bone. "Not now, when I need you most." Slowly, her eyes came up to meet Moraine's, and Moraine started back on her knees. It was said Tamara's stare could make a stone move, and at that moment Moraine believed. The Emerald shifted her gaze to Sue-Ann, still standing in front of the windows. Sue-Ann had both hands pressed to her mouth, and the teacup she had been carrying lay on the carpet at her feet. She gave a jerk under that gaze, too. Moraine's eyes found the cup she had been carrying. A good thing the cup did not break, she thought. Seafoam porcelain is quite expensive. Oh, the mind did play odd tricks when you wanted to avoid thinking about something. You are both intelligent, Tamara said finally, and not deaf, unfortunately. You know what Jatara just foretold. There was just enough question in that for both of them to nod and say that they did. Tamara sighed as if she had been wishing for a different response. Taking Jatara out of Moraine's arms, the Emerald eased her down to the carpet and smoothed her hair. After a moment, she pulled the wide blue stole from Jatara's shoulders, folded it carefully, and laid it over the keeper's face. With your permission, Mother, Sue-Ann said, in a husky voice. I'll send Ellen to fetch the keeper's serving women to do what's needful. Stay, Tamara barked. The iron-hard gaze studied them both. You will tell no one about this, not for any reason. If necessary, lie, even to a sister. Jatara died without speaking. Do you understand me? Moraine nodded jerkily, and was aware of Sue-Ann doing the same. They were not Aes Sedai yet. They still could lie, and some did occasionally, for all their efforts to behave like full sisters. But she had never been expected to be ordered to, especially not to an Aes Sedai, and never by the Amerlin seat. Good, Tamara said tiredly. Send the novice on duty is named Ellen. Send Ellen in to me. I'll tell her where to find Jatara's woman. And make sure that Ellen had heard nothing through the closed door, obviously. Otherwise, the task would have been in Sue-Ann's or Moraine's. When the girl comes in, the two of you may go. And remember, not a word, not one. The emphasis only drove home the peculiarity. An order from the Emerald seat was to be obeyed as if on oath. There was no need to emphasize anything. I wish to hear foretelling, Moraine thought, as she made her final curtsy before leaving, and what I received was a foretelling of doom. Now she wished very much that she had been more careful of what she wished for. That was the end of Chapter 2 of New Spring.